Yeah, we back. Now, welcome to a brand new series, man. Brand new series. Now, in this series, we're going to be reading a book that came out back in the year 1811, right? Now, this series is also going to be a follow-up to other series I've dropped in the past, entitled, take a look up on the screen, The Memoirs of Dessalines' Secretary. Now, that was a book that came out, I believe, in 1804, 1805, written by a gentleman by the name of Boistonnerre. Take a look up on the screen. Louis Félix Mathurin Boistonnerre was a Haitian writer and historian who is best known for having served as Dessalines' secretary. Boistonnerre was educated in Paris until 1798 when he returned to Haiti. He is the author of the 1804 Haitian Declaration of Independence. He is also known for his work chronicling the Haitian Revolution, right? So check out that playlist, read that book. That brother right there wrote that book. Yes, indeed. Shout out to the ancestor. Also, sometime last year, I dropped another series in a playlist entitled The Biography of King Henry Christophe. Check that out. I read a book essentially chronicling the life of Christophe from when he was a young boy up until his death. Check that out. Classic playlist. Now, one of my favorite series I ever dropped, and I'm probably never going to drop a better series better than this one, right? The Colonial System Unveiled. Now, this book came out in the year 1814, written by the honorable ancestor, the legendary, the incomparable Baron de Vasti. Shout out to the ancestor. Yes, indeed. Right. Now, this is what you call the genre of combat literature, which was common under the regime of Christophe. And when I say combat literature, I'm talking about ideological warfare, propaganda warfare. Right. Of course, you had the combat on the battlefield, but you also had the combat when it came to capturing the hearts and minds of the people. Right? The literature, the writings, the newspaper articles, the books, the pamphlets, etc., etc. Very common during that time. And the Colonial System Unveiled was an excellent example of combat literature because it responded directly to the European propaganda that was common during that time and also called out the European colonists directly by name. You see, in the Colonial System Unveiled, they named names. They actually put the name to the crimes committed by the colonial administrators and the French military, right? Men who back in their home country were seen as honorable men of integrity and who believed in liberty and equality, and men who claimed to be Christians, but it was exposed in his book the crimes they engaged in on the colony, right? So this book was a major expose, right? Directly called into question the hypocrisy of the Europeans of that time. And it was essentially an international indictment against all of the European powers while simultaneously being a defense for our humanity. So excellent book, classic book, The Colonial System Unveiled. Shout out to the author, the ancestor, Baron de Vasti, Christophe's right-hand man. Now, today's book is going to be a follow-up to those series that I dropped in the past. Today, we're going to go to a book, like I said, came out in 1811. I talked about it on my community tab. This book was written and published by a gentleman by the name of Julien Prévost, one of Christophe's close associates, one of the men that were part of his inner circle. And this book, essentially, I haven't read it yet. I'm reading the book along with y'all for the first time. And this book essentially chronicles the coronation of Christophe as the king of northern Haiti, his native territory, right? The establishment of the Haitian monarchy. And from what I can tell, this book was published to pay tribute to that and also legitimize the government as well. So by that time, 1811, Christophe had solidified and consolidated power in the north in totality. All the towns and cities have all came under his rule. He has taken full control over the north, while the mixed race generals in Port-au-Prince have taken full control over the south. Now, back in 1806, when Dessalines was assassinated, the army had divided into two factions, the black generals in the north and the mixed race generals in the south. And from about 1807 to 1811, it was essentially civil war between the two factions, right? The southern generals invaded the north and the northern generals invaded the south. Now, by 1811, it was pretty much settled on what the borders would be and who would get what territory. So Christophe took his northern territory that stretched all the way down to the Artibonite, and those guys pretty much had the territory stretching from Port-au-Prince down to Les Cayes, right? So the nation was divided in this fashion for over 10 years until 1820 when Christophe died and both halves were reunited. Now, anyways, back to the book, the subject of this series, right? This book is entitled The Official Account of the Glorious Events That Brought Their Royal Majesties to the Throne of Haiti, the Story of the Coronation and the Consecration of Christophe and Queen Marie-Louise. Now, like I said before, the author of this book, Julien Prévost, one of Christophe's close associates, one of his homies, right? He wrote the book. So it's going to be from his perspective, essentially writing about his close friend, right? As somebody who's part of his inner circle. And keep in mind, this was in the genre of combat literature. So in the same way how The Colonial System Unveiled was essentially a diss track against the European powers, I'm assuming this book is going to be a diss track to the Southern generals, right? Because this is going to be coming from the Northern Kingdom. So the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Republic would go back and forth when it came to books and literature and newspaper articles and pamphlets, right? So Christophe's government would drop some literature and the Southern generals would respond and they would drop some literature. So I'm assuming this is going to be in that genre of combat literature where essentially the Northern generals are going to be flexing and stunting on the Southern generals saying, look, we are a kingdom. Look at us with all this money. Look at us, our beautiful women. Look at the castle. Look at the Citadel. Look at the palace. Look, we getting money, right? Look at this 8-horse carriage, right? The Northern generals would love to flex on the Southern generals. So I'm assuming, I haven't read the book, but due to the books I've read from the Northern Kingdom in the past, I assume it's going to be in that vein, in that energy. Now, let's get into the book, man. The official account of the ascension of their royal majesties to the throne of Haiti, the ceremonies and the feasts of the coronation. Before undertaking this account of the ascension of the royal majesties to the throne, we believe it is necessary to briefly outline the principal events that took place and the principal operations that preceded this fortunate day of eternal memory. Now, time out, man. The black man back in the 1800s was highly articulate, highly intellectual. Now let's continue. The Haitian people were barely breathing, freed from the presence of these vandals who ravaged all the regions where they had taken their famous step. With disorder, brigandage, and anarchy, independence had just been founded. The state was being organized. Trade, agriculture, and navigation were being perfected. Our internal fortifications. Finally, the Haitians, united and reconciled, felt that there was, it could be, no other homeland for us on the globe than these happy and fortunate climates that the sun takes pleasure in illuminating, where it pours abundantly with complacency all of its beneficial rays on these fields with unequal abundance. These sweet reeds and these trees laden with the precious aromatic beans of Arabia, which produce the true nectar so cherished, so generally appreciated. These cottons and cocoa, etc., and so many other expensive commodities with which liberal nature has gratified Haiti. With this kindness, which is of the essence of divine providence, when our happiness was suddenly destroyed from top to bottom. Insubordination, license were introduced into the armies. Perfidious and dishonest men organized a conspiracy of which history offers few examples, as a result of which the head of the empire had perished. Now, in this part of the book, timeout, I'm assuming in this part of the book, the author of the book, Julien Prévost, is referencing Dessalines' assassination back in 1806. I think so. I'm pretty sure, right? I'm pretty sure. Now let's continue. The treasures were squandered. A small number of conspirators appropriated the spoils of the unfortunate state. Secret and dark schemes insinuated themselves into the bodies. Slander sharpened its daggers. Intrigue had worked. The Haitians ran to arms, and all the evils that the enemies of Haiti had desired and fomented were realized. Christophe had foreseen the disaster that was heading towards the country. He saw that the storm was directed particularly against the heads of the illustrious and incorruptible defenders of liberty. He realized the troublemakers intended nothing less than to take power and deliver the country over to our enemies, to fascinate and to stun the multitude with largesse and offers of supposed ranks that were offered to them with too much ease, to achieve their criminal ends more surely. Always great, always the same, raised, nurtured the revolutions amidst the din of arms. Christophe was not surprised. He knew what traitors and cowards who had brought on the misfortunes of civil war were capable of. Christophe's energy, his audacity, increased in proportion to the dangers he had to face. He faced the storms, multiplied his being, arrived with the speed of lightning in every place where it was immediately necessary, outsmarting and punishing the traitors, reviving the courage of the brave, and succeeding in triumphing over the efforts of the wicked. Now, time out. Now, keep in mind, this book was written and published by Julien Prévost, one of Christophe's close friends, one of his close associates. So obviously, he's going to be talking about his man like, yeah, that's my man. That's my dog right there, right? That's my homie. That's my friend, right? So obviously, he's going to be letting it be known that Christophe, he's that guy. So anyway, let's continue. On December 18th, 1806, by a proclamation dated from the Citadel, Christophe pointed out the secret agents of the ambitious who were agitating in all direction to bring corruption to the army. On December 24th, he marched on Port-au-Prince, deliberating with weapons in hand, still stained with the blood of the martyrs of liberty, sacrificed to their rage, their ambition, and their greed. On January 1st, 1807, Christophe fought the famous Battle of Sibert, defeated and cut to pieces Pétion's military, who was forced to throw away his decorations to protect his escape, and became bogged down up to his neck in a march before returning to Port-au-Prince. Christophe besieged the rebellious city, and reflecting on the number of conspirators he had left behind him, on those swarming in the army, whose incendiary words were not even hidden, and on the horrors that would result from a city taken by assault, Christophe postponed his conquest and made his troops return to their cantonments. Now, time out. Now, in that part of the book, they're obviously talking about, like I said before, when Dessalines died, the military was divided into two factions, right? So in that part of the book, the author of the book is referencing when Christophe marched on Port-au-Prince. He marched on the Southern generals, right? That was the first military clashes between the Northern military and the Southern military. 1807, January 1st, the Battle of Sibert. Now, let's continue. A state council composed mainly of generals and notable citizens who felt the need to establish during the stormy times, they convened and created the Constitution of February 1807, which conferred on the chief magistrate the title of President of Haiti. On February 19th, by a proclamation full of wisdom, Christophe offered a pardon and forgiveness to the sins of the rebels. And I'm assuming the rebels were the southern half of Haiti, right? The southern faction of Haiti, right? Let's continue. Without being distracted from the great thoughts he had conceived, Christophe organized the civil and commercial courts, appointed to vacant positions in the army as well as in the judiciary, activated the work of cultivation by the establishment of agricultural companies known under the name of the Guards of Police, composed mainly of managers and conductors whose usefulness is now so generally recognized in the double respect of public safety and the improvement of cultivation, restored public education, took care of the hospitals. Finally, he brought to all parts of the service that vigilant eye which embraced all the details without them harming the vast conception of the whole. The insurrection continuing to spread and the Haitians not knowing the goal of their desires, driven by that restless spirit which is natural to them, run to arms, rise up through the speeches of the apostles of rebellion, the most advantageous acts of the government administration, the regular pay established by the troops, the purchase of coffees. This very wise measure, calculated to increase the rise in the value of territorial commodities, became in the mouths of these demagogues pretext for raising the troops. The benefits of the government are weapons in the hands of our slanderers, with which they dare to fight us. A release of cash taken from the treasury of 227,000 goods to achieve the laudable goal that was set by paying coffee at 20 sous to farmers must prove to men of good faith both the greatness of the plan, the advantages that would have resulted from it, and the solicitude of the government that had ordered it. At the beginning of June 1807, Christophe went by stagecoach to the town of Gonaïves, which had been treacherously sold to the rebels. A few days were enough for him to force them to shamefully re-embark. The majority of the rebels, after seizing the town of Arcahaie, appeared before Saint-Marc, but informed of Christophe's arrival and Basile's fight, the rebels did not feel the need to wait for him and instead withdrew back to Port-au-Prince. They were pursued on their route without being able to be reached. So quick had been their flight. Now, time out, like I said, the author of the book, like I said, that's one of Christophe's close friends. So obviously, he's going to be talking about Christophe's military engagements like, yeah, Christophe marched on him, Christophe destroyed him every single time, right? You already know that's Christophe, that's one of his homies, so that's to be expected. Let's continue. In July, forces under the command of General Lamar were sent to the insurgents in the town of Port-au-Prince. The 9th Regiment rose up and deserted the cause of the legitimate authorities. Christophe marched from the mountains to repel the rebels, chased them from post to post, even to the forts of Port-au-Prince, where they entrenched themselves. Christophe attacked them there in full force, displayed the rare talents of his energy, his courage, and his ends. In less than 15 days, a legendary campaign, which was followed by the dispersion of General Lamar, the capture of all the forts in the town of Port-au-Prince, and a large number of prisoners were taken. Now, in that part of the book, I believe, talking about, like I said, the military engagements, the civil wars between the two factions of the military, the northern generals versus the southern generals, right? The black generals up north, the mixed race generals down south. So General Lamar, that was a southern general that was fighting on the behalf of Alexander Pichon from the south, right? So they're saying Christophe marched into the town of Port-au-Prince, destroyed them boys, had them boys running. They left the town and Christophe took a whole bunch of prisoners. And this was during the time where he was finally consolidating his full power over the north and all the towns were fully submitting to his authority. Now let's continue. In illness, the results of fatigue from the campaign suspended the complete reduction of the rebels. Operations were no longer vigorously pursued. They were content to guard the town of Port-au-Prince, and overconfident, they disdained or maybe neglected to pursue the small number of fugitives who were still in the woods. This was a fatal error. Numerous reinforcements were sent to General Lamar. The rebels, with the help of their barges, found the means to feed their accomplices and provide them with ammunition. General Lamar rallied his partisans and presented himself in an advantageous position in the mountains, a few leagues away from the town of Port-au-Prince. Christophe, barely recovered from his illness and still in a state of convalescence, left to put himself at the head of the troops. God damn. The ancestors was different, man. I gotta run that back. Christophe, barely recovered from his illness and still in a state of convalescence, left to put himself at the head of the troops, again drove the rebels from all the positions they occupied. He himself charged them at the head. Oh my God. Time out. Oh no. Let's continue. He himself charged them at the head of his staff. He put to flight and routed and pursued them on all sides. Christophe saw with sensitivity that these unfortunate men were returning from their errors. During this expedition, the troops of the West rivaled those of the North in courage and in bravery, still chasing away the rebels who had the audacity to attack the cordon. It was on this memorable day of September 20th when 8 battalions of loyal troops defeated 21 of those of the rebels. Now, time out. I want to stop and point something out in that part of the book, right? The author of the book, keep in mind, one of Christophe's close associates, a man of high status from the North, right? He actually showed love and paid homage to the Southern generals. Now, he said the Army of the West, but the Army of the West was the same as the South. The Southern generals controlled the southern and part of the western portion of the country. So when they say the West, they also mean the generals from the South. He actually said in the book that the armies of the West rivaled the army of the North in terms of their courage and their bravery. So even though the nation is currently divided in two halves, the author of the book actually pays homage and shows respect to the Southern military and actually says that even though currently right now we view them as rebels, we still admire their courage and their bravery regardless, right? So to me, even though, family is beefing right now, some of that love and respect, it still remains. Now let's continue. This example proves that bravery is inseparable from honor and loyalty. These rebel troops, who cannot withstand the sight and presence of those subject to legitimate authority, are nevertheless the same who conquered the South from the French army. Right? Now, time out. He said these rebel troops, right, who are, keep in mind, he said they're still beneath us, right? They're still inferior to us, but still, these are the same men that conquered the South from the French military, right? So he says, even though right now these are just rebels that we are trying to, destroy, we still respect the fact that these were the same men that destroyed the French during those battles in the South. Let's continue. While the rebellion seems to be consolidating in the South, legitimate authority found one of its staunch defenders in General Jean-Baptiste Perier, known as Goman, who broke away from the rebels, raised the banner of loyalty and honor in the mountains of Gondance in the town of Jérémie, and rallied his brothers, enlightened them, and disabused them of the absurd slander of the rebels, and paid homage to Christophe, whom he recognized as the sole leader of the country. He constantly keeps the rebels in check and in continual alarm. He swoops down with the speed of an eagle in the place where he is not expected, leaves traces of his passages there, and returns to inaccessible places that he has chosen. From the moment that major forces march on him, he shows himself incorruptible to all the caresses and the temptations and the promises that the rebels make to attract him. He defies at the same time their threats and their ruses, and always shows himself invincible. Now, time out. Now, in that part of the book, like I said, we're still talking about the Civil War between the North and the South. Now, in that part of the book, the author made a reference to a gentleman by the name of Goman, aka Jean-Baptiste Perier. Now, take a look up on the screen. From 1807 to 1819, Goman led an autonomous farmers' republic that was situated in the Southwest. The peasant insurrection was financed by Christophe. Now, like I said, Christophe was at war with the generals in the South. So he was financing and arming certain individuals, certain, influential figures in the South to destabilize the regime in the South. And one of those individuals was a gentleman by the name of Goman, also known as Jean-Baptiste Perier. That was who the author of the book was talking about, who he said comes down from the mountains with the speed of an eagle and always keeps the rebels in check. Right? Now let's continue. Military expeditions as brilliant as those that we have reported, having failed to discuss the rebels, so blind is presumption. They again directed towards the end of October an attempt against the town of Saint-Marc. Christophe went to this city, and the day after his arrival, he had them attack the Pivert and the Florenceau plantations, where they had time to entrench themselves to the teeth. The day of the 25th was also memorable for the two actions that took place, following which the rebels were overthrown and pursued to the utmost by Christophe's mounted guards. A large number of prisoners were also taken, and the battlefields were strewn with corpses. The coffers and flags of the rebels fell into our hands. It was there that the miseries of war were seen displayed in all their horror. Unfortunate fugitives lost in the woods in fishing boats, dying of thirst and hunger, cursing the traitors who exposed them to such a deplorable fate, and seeking like new Europeans the shores of the sea to return to their barges, which were lying at anchor, as the only shelter where they could find salvation. It was on this day that the brilliant valor of our troops were also seen. But a special praise must find its place here for the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 2nd Regiment and the 1st Battalion of the 27th, who, after the fatigue of 36 leagues of marching without any rest, contributed so effectively to the glory of this day. The women of Saint-Marc gave on this occasion, as on those preceded and followed it, proof of their patriotism, of that burning love of the homeland, that character of the ancient Spartans. Spectators of the battle, they applauded from the top of the ramparts the valor of our troops, and were the first to make the cries of victory heard. Their generous care came to soften and console suffering humanity by providing the wounded with their aid their condition required. Gratitude has since rewarded the zeal and loyalty of the Western Province in calling the town of Saint-Marc the Faithful, a title as honorable as it is glorious for her. The enemies were chased away. Christophe, with his usual activity, left the town of Saint-Marc on the 28th, and on November 1st, he was in the town of Port-de-Paix. After passing through Goman and crossing the mountains of Saint Louis, and without taking any rest, Christophe traveled through the town of Port-de-Paix, evacuated the formidable position of Calvaire, which the rebels had seized, returned to the city, organized a system of attack as well as defense, and on the 7th, he returned to his capital. During September of the following year, so many setbacks having not disgusted the rebels, they were to experience the futility of their attempts. One of their most formidable incursions, starting from Port-au-Prince, and for which they had requisitioned from childhood to old age, threatened the western cordon at all points, while General Lamar, by a reckless blow, stationed himself with all the forces he could muster in the center of the mountains in the town of Port-de-Paix, also threatening the city. In the west, the camps and the posts were successively attacked and became the scene of the valor of our troops and that of the losses of the enemy. The rebels sent detached parties to pillage and burn isolated dwellings, a type of brigandage in which they excel, especially when these dwellings are far from any protection. Then, gathering their troops, they formed a plan to besiege the town of Saint-Marc, but at a very reasonable distance. They took up positions appearing impregnable. They organized camps, not trusting their numbers. They built entrenchments upon entrenchments in double and triple tiers and carried out gigantic works. They facilitated the arrival of the munitions and provisions they received by means of their privateers, who themselves anchored at the bay. They remained in these positions for 25 days. As famine was making itself felt, considerable detachments of their bands roamed the mountains to plunder some food. But mobile columns of our armies pushed them back. Bayonets were fixed each time they appeared near cultivated areas. Efforts were made to effectively drive out the rebels, and by skillfully establishing manned batteries, they succeeded in causing them considerable harm, to the point of forcing them to dig ditches for shelter from our bombs and cannonballs to intercept their water and all kinds of food. Now, timeout. Currently in the book, as you can see, we're still talking about the military engagements between the northern generals and the southern generals, right? The north led by Christophe and the south led by General Alexander Pétion. Now, a few differences between the two factions, the northern faction and the southern faction. The northern faction was more of a centralized authority, right? The government held a lot of control and influence over the economy. Yes, the farmers and the cultivators were given 1/4 of the profits made from the agriculture, but the rest went back to the state to reinvest in projects and development and things like that. Whereas in the South, it was more so laissez-faire type of economy. In contrast to the black monarchy from the North, the Southern mixed race generals, due to the fact that a lot of them were the sons of the French colonists, they believed in private land ownership, laissez-faire economy, right? Private citizens engaging in private business endeavors. Whereas Christophe, the state had a lot of control over the economy and the agriculture and the import and the exports. And the Southern generals wanted more, freedom and less control and oversight from the state. And over time, as time went on, the Northern Kingdom would become rapidly developing and prospering, and the Southern Republic would continue to rot away in, despotism and poverty and corruption and things like that, right? A very small elite controlling the majority of the wealth and the economy, and the rest of the citizens basically living in poverty. And that's what the Southern Republic was about, in contrast to the kingdom, where you had, like I said, building projects, citadels, palaces, chateaus, hospitals, universities, military fortifications, theaters, printing press. It was crazy. Anyway, let's continue. It was decided to occupy the position to the enemy's rear and to cut off their retreat. I knew that a brave general was no less determined than to request the disposition of a part of the Western forces to pass through the mountains and to seize the town of Port-au-Prince, devoid of forces while the rebels were dying of hunger, surrounded in their position. However, the provision squadron, which had left the Cap to go to the aid of the town of Saint-Marc, did not arrive. The comms held it back. But with what pleasure was it seen by our army, setting full sail on the rebel ships and capturing 7 of their privateers, leaving Port-au-Prince with munition and provisions, which they brought to the aid of their accomplices, the others escaping under full sail. The operations became more active. It was resolved to make new and vigorous efforts to drive out the rebels and no longer give them time to breathe. Positions within pistol range were established and the rebels, pressed in close, machine gunned and shot, no longer dared to appear. Finally, all the places were guarded to cut off the retreat. Should have made us take good advantage of their distress. But on November 18th, the rebels evacuated by a road abandoned since the revolution and covered with creepers and logwoods that had been thought impassable. They were nevertheless pursued, and it is mentioned in this affair that Pichon disguised himself as a woman, a large part of whom were in the camps, and that our troops led past, only focusing on pursuing the combatants. Now, time out. I cannot verify that account. Where it says that General Alexander Pichon disguised himself as a woman in order to escape, during the military engagement. Like I said, this was in the genre of combat literature. So obviously they're going to be sending shots and dissing the Southern generals. I don't know if that was a real account or if that was hyperbole. I've been told that was a joke, that they were simply, cracking jokes on Pichon. I don't know if he was literally disguised as a woman dressed in drag. I cannot verify that account. If he was being literal or being, figurative or being comedic, I don't really know, right? I don't know if the ancestor was trying to be entertaining or funny. I don't know, but I cannot verify that claim if Pichon was really dressed as a woman in order to escape. I don't know, but that was funny though. Let's continue. The places abandoned by the rebels offered the spectacle of a real cemetery by the large quantity of graves they had contained. General Lamar, having, as we already said, established his position in the mountains of Port-au-Prince and fortified on a par with those of Port-au-Prince, saw himself, like them, surrounded and lacking everything he needed. He became agitated with the rage of despair, launching attack after attack, which we always repelled, forcing him to return to his entrenchments, not without loss. To give an idea of the fury displayed in this part, a fury found only in civil wars, the terrible ramparts on both sides found themselves leaning against each other to the point that neither dared to raise their head without being shot on the ground. Extreme and truly frightening means were employed to annihilate the fanatics. Underground fighting took place. Saps and mines were dug with tireless courage, carried away the rebels' ramparts, sending entire battalions of grenadiers flying into the air. The ground was covered with the dead, the dying and shattered limbs, while others found their tomb in the bowels of the earth. What a distressing picture for humanity. Let us continue, however. The truth compels me not to disguise our misfortunes. These same destroyed ramparts were immediately occupied. Murderous fusillades were established on their ruins, while new ramparts rose and replaced the first. Finally, after 1,000 battles, famine, losses, and disease, and desertions forced the rebels to force the lines, to evacuate and to withdraw back to the town of the Mole. The district of Goman, the mountains of Port-au-Prince, Moustique, and Jean Abel finally breathed. The farmers returned to their work. The army cordons off the mountains surrounding the town of Mole besieged the place. In the Spanish part, some conspirators sold to the rebels like Etienne Albert and Gilbert tried to deceive them by inciting them against us, but they received at their own hands the price of their treason. Christophe's skillful policy seized the moment. He was happy about the overthrow of the Spanish monarchy in Europe to get closer to those of Haiti. Christophe had understood for a long time that inhabitants of the same land, the same need should unite us as brothers with the Haitian Spaniards, since the same enemies threaten our existence. Now, time out. Now, it seems to me that Christophe had the same, misconceptions as Dessalines. They believed that those in the Spanish colonies had the same hatred or animosity for their colonial adversaries as those in the other colonies like the British and the French, not knowing that those in the Spanish colonies had somewhat of an admiration or a kinship with the Spanish colonists. Christophe believed that, they wanted to overthrow the Spanish like we wanted to overthrow the French, but that wasn't always the case in the Spanish colonies. Now let's continue. To this end, Christophe sounded out their intentions. He finds them as well disposed as he is. Christophe sent weapons and munitions of war to General Don Juan Sanchez Ramirez, and with his generous aid, he put him in position to undertake offensive operations against the city of Santo Domingo to attack this place where General Ferran and the French troops who still occupied the point had taken refuge. Now, time out. I believe they're talking about Juan Sanchez Ramirez, a Dominican general who was the leader of the War of the Reconquista, who led the troops who defeated the French who were stationed on the Spanish territory. Like I said, after the revolution, some French troops, instead of going back to France, they crossed over the border into the Spanish territory. And this general right here, this individual right here, with the assistance of Christophe, Christophe sent over weapons over the border. Not saying that Christophe was the sole reason that he was victorious, but Christophe did contribute to driving out the French out of the Spanish territory by sending arms and ammunition to the Dominican generals of the time, the most notable being Juan Sanchez Ramirez. Now, take a look up on the screen. Juan Sanchez Ramirez was a Dominican general who was the primary leader of the War of the Reconquista. He is known for leading the troops in the Battle of Palo Hinchado. The decisive Dominican victory resulted in the end of French rule in the Eastern Hispaniola in 1809. He was the first Dominican to serve as the governor of Santo Domingo. Now, obviously, during that time, Christophe and Juan Sanchez Ramirez had similar interests. And obviously, Christophe, overloaded with ammunition. He was like, listen, bro, hold some of these guns, bro. Do your thing, bro. Now let's continue. Christophe reopened the old ties of trade and friendship with this just, loyal, and sensitive people, and the sequel has proven that he has no reason to regret it. The furies of war, of which we have given a brief outline, did not prevent the head of the government from taking care of the happiness of the people in the camps. He felt that only wise administration of state revenues could save it. Honest administrators replaced those who had prevaricated in their functions. A commission for the verification of accounts was established. The state then experienced the immensity of its resources. The troops were dressed, equipped, and well paid. A navy was suddenly created, and already our sailors, who had only maneuvered light vessels, learned, and with the help of the compass, to sail with 3 masts, to cross in the most stormy waters, to resist the violence of the tempest. The Haitian flag appeared with glory on the astonished ocean, and one saw with surprise and admiration a new seafaring people. Not only did the navy become the terror of the rebels, but it wrested from the empire of the seas, of which they were so in vain. The Citadel, the Palladium of Liberty, this majestic boulevard of independence, this monument to Christophe's grandeur and vast combinations, was built on the brow-like summit of one of the highest mountains on the entire island, from which one can see on its left side and the mirror of its superb canal. Opposite the hills and the town of Cap Henry, its harbor, the vast expanse of the seas. On the right, La Grange, Monte Cristi, the town of Feuillal, the Bay of Manzanil and the surrounding mountains. One is recreated by the view of the beautiful plain and the magnificent carpet of greenery that unfolds before one's eyes. Behind it, the long chain of mountains seems to be the setting for this enchanting picture. This position, fortified by nature, to which art comes to add all its science, casemated, bomb-proof, it protects it from being effectively besieged. These guns, these terrible machines of war, conquerors of difficulties, cross the elevation of a mountainous ground to dominate the territory that it commands, and protects the entire part of the north. What am I saying? The entire part of Haiti, of which this fortress is the most formidable rampart on the island. Even if the interior fortifications had only the advantage of having learned to consider the loss of seaports as nothing, they would still be very important from this point of view alone. A nation that strongly believes that the guarantee of the individual preservation of its members exists only in the favored places of its soil, and that this guarantee is found only in its courage and the sacrifices it will make, and especially in the woods, the mountains, which are so familiar to us, will this nation, I say, be able to worry about the momentary abandonment of some cities that it will have had the good policy and the salutary precaution of setting on fire to upon the approach of our enemies? Especially when its wise foresight has already caused it, so to speak, to abort the plans of its oppressors by supplying itself with everything it needs to resist all the attacks that could be directed against us. The town of Sans-Souci, this favorite city that was to become the capital of northern Haiti, was being established. Ravines were being filled, mountains were being leveled, public roads were being aligned. This superb royal palace, the glory of Haiti, carried to the skies both the beauty and the boldness of its construction. Its sumptuous apartments, parqueted, paneled with the finest and rarest mahogany, collected at great expense and with scrupulous care. The furniture, these elegant tapestries that good taste created, these gardens embellished with symmetry, where pure water always in a degree of freshness that particularly characterizes it. These fountains, these fruit trees, these European productions came to embellish the retreat of a hero and to be admired by foreigners, while a church whose bold dome pleasantly outlined the riches of its architecture and other public establishments, such as arsenals, military barracks, and shipyards, rose despite the ravages of war. To see the astonishing activity spread throughout all these works, one would have said that the greatest tranquility reigned, and that the hand of peace was perfecting them. Immense capital, fruits of the savings of the treasury, filled the spacious coffers of Citadel Henry. I know that one of the intentions of our monarch is to tile and panel the rotunda of the palace in the Citadel in quadruple rooms. He is rich enough to do it. This apartment of a new kind would reflect a precious drapery and would have no equal in the entire world. On the front piece of this monument should be written the motto of Louis XIV, Nec pluribus impar. And I believe that is a Latin phrase. If you translate it to English, that means not equal to many, or unequal to the task of ruling many, right? Essentially means that my powers and abilities are, powerful enough to govern a vast realm and even multiple territories. Let's continue. A worthy minister of the altars, a philanthropic author, Father Gregoire, who since the beginning of his career has devoted his pen to the search for the truth, to the defense of humanity, has just, through his touching work on the literature of the Negroes, written with the eloquence and simplicity of truth, avenged our rights by loudly publishing in the face of his compatriots both their crimes and the injustice of the supposed superiority of their species over ours. Christophe read his book with all the interest it inspired. Christophe voted him thanks recorded in a Haitian work, La Queue de la Nature, which equally honors both the virtuous prelate to whom they are addressed and the head of the government who pays him such a public homage, so flattering with his gratitude. The siege of the town of Mole had been converted into a land and sea blockade. Christophe wanted to suppress the rebels while sparing the blood of his own soldiers. It was during their cruise past this place that our sailors learned their trade and achieved the superiority they have now attained. One feature of these Jean Barts of the New World should not be overlooked. Having missed the anchorage of the platform at the beginning of the night of March 28, 1809, they fell among 5 ships of the rebels of Port-au-Prince, who were furtively trying to throw relief to the town of Mole. The commander of the ship held them in check with a bold maneuver and the fire of his musketry and cannons until daybreak, when our squadron was able to go to his aid to free him and pursue the rebels to their lair, after having thwarted their expedition. 4 months after this event, a new incursion of the same force as that of September 1808, still aiming to free General Lamar, was to take place. The rebels had forgotten the numerous defeats they had suffered in so many places. They still needed a lesson, which they soon saw again. But knowing the surroundings of the town of Saint-Marc only too well, they were content to present themselves before the town of Mirebalais. And while they pretended to want to attack him, almost the entire force pushed into the Spanish part in order to fall unexpectedly on Gullivier, and promising themselves no less in their mad presumptions than to come to the capital as they loudly declared. Christophe, informed of the rebels' plans, did not want to take any measures to give them a confidence which he was sure they would abuse. The event justified his conjectures. It was only upon their arrival that troops were sent against them to overcome them without giving the rebels time to gather any intelligence. They were immediately attacked and put to flight. The perfidest general, Davitois, commander of the expedition, lost his life in this battle. Several of the leaders fell into our power. Pursued by our troops, who joined up with those of the West in the Spanish savannas, arrived, and they found the Artibonite swollen by the rains. Some of them tried to swim across it and were swept away in the waves. Our army having joined them, the fighting became very fierce. They were charged by Christophe's horse guard, overturned and scattered on all sides. The loss of those who were drowned is estimated at 2 battalions. General Lamar also tried to make an attack on the cordon, but he found a bronze wall that he could not pierce and abandoned his enterprise. His horse and 2 of his aides-de-camp and an infinite number of his accomplices on the ground. Here is a paragraph that contains a very just and sensible reflection from the General Order of the Army of August 17, 1809, which reports on these 2 victories. It said, "It is in vain that the wise policy of His Highness, the President Christophe, wants to avoid attacking the rebels in order to give them time to repent. These ungrateful beings misunderstand his paternal intentions, because one does not carry iron and flame to their homes, where the innocent will be victims of the resulting disaster. They imagine that one does not have the means to subdue them, but it is more effective to subdue them than to leave them to their own devices. In their senseless blindness, they come to receive the punishment of their crimes." The disorganizing faction that had placed Petro at its head, not seeing him respond to its wishes, to the goal it set for itself, and convinced moreover by the experience it had of the inadequacy of his talents and energy, requested the recall of General Rigaud, born obviously for the misfortune of his country, by the sad and deplorable effects that his rebellion against Governor Louverture had produced. Misfortunes which are too well known to mask his plans and the goal that the perfidest government that employs him has in mind, and to further abuse and mislead him about his connivance. He makes him adopt the pretext of an escape as if there were nothing easier to load the prudence of a restless and suspicious police force. like the one Napoleon Bonaparte established in his states, and whose agents and spies swarm in all the courts, and even in all the parts of the earth to carry out the plans of their master. One would have to be very blind to think that an unfortunate islander could have escaped from the dungeons where he had languished, as long as the opportunity had not presented itself to make him serve the purposes expected of him. Besides, his arrival and the means by which he started would be enough to remove any kind of doubt in this regard. He therefore leaves under an assumed and disguised name. He is accompanied by 2 aides-de-camp, which clearly implies the role he is intended to play. He arrives in the United States, addressed and recommended to some French agents. He remains hidden so as not to give rise to any suspicion, any hold against him. He is nevertheless reported by the friends of our government. He slips away, avoids the British cruisers, and lands on April 7th, 1810, towards the evening, in the town of Lecay. Now, on the screen, I got a gentleman by the name of André Rigaud. That is who they were talking about in that part of the book, right? André Rigaud, take a look up on the screen. Benoit Joseph André Rigaud was the leading mulatto military leader during the Haitian Revolution. Among his proteges were Alexandre Pétion and Jean-Pierre Boyer, both future presidents of Haiti. André Rigaud rebelled against Toussaint Louverture's government, leading to the War of the South. Now, as we're talking about right now, the civil war between the North and the South, this was simply a continuation of the rivalry that was initiated when, like they said, André Rigaud back in 1799 rebelled against the authority of Toussaint Louverture, right? So when you see Christophe now going against Alexandre Pétion, that was simply a continuation of those struggles between the North and the South. Christophe, the protege of Toussaint, Alexandre Pétion, the protege of Rigaud, that rivalry still continued. Now, in 1810, André Rigaud escaped from a French prison and landed back in southern Haiti. So that's what they were talking about in that part of the book, right? Oh, he slipped away from the police. He went to the United States. He avoided the British authorities, and somehow he landed in Haiti. Now, the author of the book basically says that he asked the question, how could a prisoner in France, right? How did he escape French prison, somehow leave with his military personnel, then go to the United States, avoid all these, ships and avoid the authorities, and somehow land back in Haiti? The author of the book, Julien Prévost, he believes that he was sent by the French government. That's what he believes. That's what he insinuated in that part of the book, right? Now, I'm going to end part 1 right there. We get end part 1 right here, right? I didn't even expect to go this long. So we can cap off part 1 right here. It seems that it's going to be a very long book. Hopefully, I can get through this series in a decent amount of parts. I don't want it to be too crazy, so I'm going to try my best. So yeah, this is part 1. I believe we are currently in the year 1810, basically giving us a recap of what led Christophe to rise into power, becoming the king of the North. That's essentially what we're talking about. The book is written from one of Christophe's close associates, one of his close friends and high-ranking members of the government, Julien Prévost. So anyways, man, excellent literature left behind by the ancestors. As always, and keep in mind, this was the first book published in the Western Hemisphere, by black men from our own independent printing presses. This was the first book ever established, ever released by the kingdom, right? So very, very important literature. Anyways, not gonna be here too long, man. It's your boy Neferkari Dessalines, back in the Billy, yes indeed. Cash App in the description. Support the channel. Support the Patreon. Link in the description. Pinned comment at the top. Support the album Sahel 1816. Go to my homepage, go to my playlist section. Enjoy the album, and I'm gone. Peace.
Told me she loved me and said that it's real. So independent, ain't signing no deal. Feel like a king and I'm up at Cap Henry. I'm in the Citadel, top of the hill. Trying to run up, but we let off a cannon. Secret location, I'm keeping it sealed. You ain't retaliate, Franco Medina came to the country and he got killed. You ain't retaliate, Rafi Mans. Thought you was loyal, thought you was real. Didn't even want to come pick up the body. Had your man locked up, he died in the cell. Up at the palace, I'm throwing a party. Right on the south and I'm giving them hell. And my little shorty, she looking exotic. African features, she casting a spell. Run to the check like I work on my fitness. Wake up each morning and handle my business. Say that she love me, she want my genetics. Wanna get married and make it official. Wanna get married and have all my babies. Up in the city, I'm riding Mercedes. Up in the city, they treat me like royalty. Feeling like Dolph, talking about lords. Spreading my wings and I had to get fly. Up in the top, an incredible vibe. Came from the bottom, I'm up in the sky. Gave one look and said, baby, you fine. Wake up each morning and handle my business. They just be talking, you see me, I live it. Ride on my enemies, sounding like thunder. 1804 got that shit in my spirit. 1804 when I step in the building. 1804 and that's word of my mother. Rock my women and die for my brother. Never gon' fall when I'm deep under pressure. Tell them we back and they better accept it. Move like a king, every step is divine. Ride on my enemies with no exception. Taking revenge and I'm taking what's mine. Pour up a drink and it's time that we toast. Watching my back, keep my enemies close. Only the family, I stick with my brothers. Cannons position outside of the coast. Heavy artillery for the protection. Move like a general, stick to the code. Feel like a king when I'm up in the north. Beautiful women, they trying to get chose. Launch an invasion all over the south. Capture the capital with all my woes. Look at my energy and my demeanor. Dripping that ice and that's head to my toes. Lately I'm flexing all on the Americans. Flexing my muscle on missing my road. Just got a carriage just coming from London. Boy, that shit cash, I ain't taking no loans. Boy, that shit cash, that's fresh on the boat. Enemy know I got millions in gold. Enemy know I got choppers and cannons. How did I do it? They can't understand it. How did I do it? It's cause I'm relentless. Call me King Harry, my name is cemented. Call me King Harry, I'm up in the palace. Call me King Harry, I'm raising the status.